Lords of the Fallen was one of the major releases near the end of 2023, and functions as both a sequel to the original 2014 game, The Lords of the Fallen, and a reboot of the entire franchise. Along with Lies of P, Blasphemous 2, and others, it built hype around the entire genre of Souls-likes, capping off a year full of notable releases, before crashing spectacularly on its debut. People found enough wrong with the game's performance and multiplayer functions that it underwent, in the developer's own words, a death by 1,000 cuts in the public eye. In a world full of video games releasing in a broken state or just not living up to the marketing, it would have been easy enough for the studio behind the game to cut their losses, pretend Lords never happened, and move on. That is not what happened. Since then, it's been fighting its way back to a positive rating on Steam and trying to prove itself to be a worthwhile use of your time and money through a network of updates and added content. All of this leading up to a sequel announcement last year that's become materialized into a full reveal trailer as I'm beginning this final draft. It is a mixture of these weirdnesses, these faults and fixes surrounding the game, and my own experiences playing it over the last 2 years that's had me kicking this project around in my mind since I decided to begin making video game essays. Actually, if you go back and listen to my very first video, I refer to making a deep dive that was taking too long. This, finally, is it. And the longer it evolves, for every layer that I peel away from this thing, the more I find to talk about. For the 2 years this game has been writhing around in my mind, now feels like the most correct time of any to finally get this out there. For my money, I think that Lords has proven that a bad game can be curated into a good one. Combined with what's actually inside the thing, it ends up being one of the most interesting Souls-likes that we have. And so, I'd like to tell you the story of the game as I went looking for the deepest secrets it had to offer in terms of story and gameplay, and try to pull from all of this a tiny look at where the Souls-like genre is heading. A few basically bullet points before we begin. Certain parts, like here at the beginning, go pretty in-depth about the narrative itself, and we'll kind of jump in and out of that as we talk about how the game looks and plays. I've also stayed away from watching lore explanation videos on this particular game over the years, so I might get some lore incomplete or even correct for how much it's about that stuff. What we're not covering here is the first game, or anything more than the surface level connections between the two. I still haven't seen much of the original because as of writing this, it's $30 on GOG, which is lunacy. Alright, that's pretty much everything. Let's get into it. Oh, no, wait, one more thing. This game is absolute fucking metal.
After eons of tyranny, the demon god Adir was finally overthrown by humanity. Though fear of his terrible power endured. And so was formed the hallowed sentinels. Our duty being to stand vigil for signs of his return. Even exile to another realm could not silence the fallen god forever.
The game opens with a few cutscenes that alone could probably be its own video for how much information is being conveyed. A lot of it might not make sense to the new player, but if you do a close reading of everything going on, it's putting in an astounding amount of work. To begin to understand the dark fantasy world that these games take place in, it's important to know about the central conflict between the two gods of the world, Aureus and Adir. As the former ruler over primordial mankind and creator of the demonic species known as the Rogar, Adir tidily fits the description of a god of chaos, even if it never truly says that part out loud. In the other corner, we have Aureus, god of radiance and law, and the currently dominant religion in the Oathlands. Unlike most fantasy or pantheon deities, the gods don't appear to have a single domain or element they exert control over, but like all deities, instead battle to see who can be the bigger tyrant over the mortals they pit against each other. What appears on the surface as a simple God versus Satan story is actually more akin to the weird fantasy cosmology of Michael Moorcock's writings, where the Lords of Law and Lords of Chaos are in an eternal struggle to push their side of the balance over the tipping point. Neither side is the correct one to pick, and both transcend normal human ideas of morality. Both are parasitic, relying on the fervor they can whip up in their host or servants to carry out their will, while they try to remain cosmically aloof. I really recommend the underappreciated Elric of Melniboné series if you're wanting to get into some of the best fantasy writing ever, period. But I digress. Interestingly enough, the opening cutscene doesn't begin by explaining exactly what happened during the first game. Rather, it focuses more on a generalized history of the world and what happens in the aftermath of what the internet calls the neutral ending of the original game. It also begins with a very important little poem thingy that I showed at the beginning but will read here again. Ages pass, distorting self-delusion into faith. In the conflict of the divine, are mortals merely pawns? Whether the flesh of gods or death itself, all will be consumed, for she must feed. After finding a way to kill the demon god Adir, who used to rule over mankind in the world these games take place in, the main character of the original game, Harkin, instead hands the tool over to a group who use the rune to prevent Adir's return without fully destroying him. While never explicitly stating this in the introduction, we're 1,000 years removed from the events of that original Lords of the Fallen, and time seems to have forgotten Harkin's role in sealing away the demon god. As the Church of Aureus rose in power, like all religions, it split into dozens of factions and orders to fill different roles in society, and continue the dominance of the new faith. Conveniently enough for world history, the group that was established in honor of these events, the Hallowed Sentinels, take full credit, either willfully or unknowingly leaving out the part where one of their own condemned prisoners ended up saving mankind, for a time. Setting up these questions of whether the Church knowingly suppressed Harkin's story in order to make themselves look better, or time had simply forgotten the names, makes looking back and seeing these tiny details of story building so much more compelling. And more importantly, this wouldn't be the last time that the Church of Orion Radiance turned to unorthodox or even heretical means to achieve their ends. Nowadays, whenever these exceptions need to be made, the Dark Crusaders are called in. After the fall of Adir and prevention of his return, the Hallowed Sentinels created 5 magical seals at holy sites across Mornstead to serve as beacons to alarm the world if the demon god's influence should begin to rise yet again. As time goes on, corruption begins to eat away at the foundations of the new society. Plague sweeps across the land, and the king falls deeply ill. Eventually, the kingdom collapses as the beacons are corrupted. Over the course of the 2 introduction cutscenes, we see signs of how this conflict plays out both on a world scale, then with a clever subversion that introduces the game's novel edition, the Umbral Lamp. While I never played more than a few minutes of the original game, I do remember at the time not liking the fact that you were stuck playing a particular named character, in this instance Harkin, a criminal who I think was condemned to die. I haven't played Sekiro yet, so I didn't understand that this could be done to greater effect. And so, while most players coming to the 2023 version of Lords probably understood beforehand they'd get to design their own character, the 2 people who played the original and didn't know this wouldn't be shocked to see a protagonist introduced to them in the intro. Now, decked out in black plate mail and wielding a big-ass sword, the Dark Crusader makes an introduction similar to Harkin's back in 2014, breaking down doors and fighting his way through a besieged kingdom in media res. After he's done kicking some skeleton ass and giving a cinematic look at what we'll be doing in a second, he's confronted by a 4-armed demon thing that quickly kills him. Twice. We learn a lot from this little interaction that's more immediately useful to us. The lamp brings whoever is holding it back from the dead, and that asshole with the 4 arms really wants it, yet can't seem to just pick the thing up despite, the 4 arms. The subversion I like so much comes from introducing this figure who was supposed to be the main character they gave to us, with all this badass design and voice acting, before saying, just kidding, and tossing us into the character creator. Having already played most of the starting classes before, I decided to go a slightly different route than most first-time players would, and opted for the Condemned class. This is the equivalent of the Deprived from games like Dark Souls, where you begin with the lowest stats and least equipment of any other option. I wanted to do this for a surprising number of reasons. Firstly, because I've been so inspired by the Dark Souls as Miyazaki intended videos from the Jamothi YouTube channel, which I cannot recommend enough, either for entertainment value or trying to follow along. Using this style of playthrough and not being able to rely on the relatively powerful starting equipment you get for each class, I would be able to explore the item placements and figure that more into the storytelling of each level than I have previously done. Secondly, I wanted to see how much of a difficulty spike there was for a full Condemned playthrough compared to, say, the Dark Crusader or Warwolf starting classes, after several balances and tweaks to the game math. Lastly, and probably most importantly, I needed both my stats used for spellcasting, Inferno and Radiance, to be as high as possible for a starting character, and a Condemned starts with a respectable 10 all across the board. Like most Souls games, you can go pure strength for your build and make things pretty much a cakewalk. There are weapons in the game that require extremely high physical stats to be wielded, and two-handing a massive weapon lends itself well to staggering out lesser enemies while you hack them into a puddle of viscera. However, this game centers so heavily around the religious aspects that it's, in my opinion, the intended route to invest a few levels into either of the spiritual stats, the aforementioned Radiance and Inferno. One of the ways that the game rewards this is by giving the player a fuller picture of the world's lore via item descriptions based off of the item and your stat investment. It's a much more interesting dynamic to be able to read the detailed item descriptions that rely on having a high enough Radiance or Inferno stat to reveal it, and take in the more biased worldview that's presented depending on whether you're following Aureus or Adir. For players like me who get a lot out of the game by reading things like lore descriptions, this is a more immersive way of explaining things, and I really enjoy this way of holding back and rewarding information based on stat choices. Veterans of the game probably already recognize where I'm going with this build, but for those of you kind enough to be listening to this without having played the game, you may be wondering, well, what happens if you invest in the two stats that are the most opposed to one another? The answer is a third path, the Umbral Caster. We're getting to Umbral stuff in a second, don't worry. After choosing your character's class and appearance, the game begins with a pretty immediate objective. With you having been a corpse brought suddenly back to life moments ago by the Umbral Lamp, and without much time to explain things, this guy with indescribable drip recognizes that the lamp has chosen you as its new bearer, and immediately inducts you into the Order of the Dark Crusaders. With that dragon-riding demon still actively hunting the lamp, he gives you a mission to meet him at a safer location past the village, and heads off to let you begin the tutorial. I won't be going over every one of the levels in as much detail as I kinda need to for the first 3-ish levels, since the most important setup of the entire game takes place between the cutscenes we've talked about and the first Guardian. About 80% of the NPC quests are started in the very first hours, as well as introducing all of the combat and exploration mechanics. I don't mean to spoil the surprise now, but this is also about as linear as the game gets. It takes a while to get there the first time, but after this first act of the game, the sequencing gets messier and messier before the end. The Defiled Sepulchre teaches the most basic movement and control mechanics of the game, things like sprinting and jumping, before also forcing the player to use their Umbral Lamp for the first time. Shifting into the Umbral Realm requires the player to either hold it and focus for a moment before breaking through some sort of barrier into the other world, or die. Once you're dropped in the first time, or focus and cross over, you're in the Umbral. If you're dropped again while there, you drop your Vigor and are transported to the last vestige you rested at. If you're familiar with these types of games and are getting this vague sense early on that Lords of the Fallen is kind of like they carved these massive pieces out of different FromSoft games and stitched them together, you're not entirely wrong. I could see an integral memo or design doc snippet reading something like, you fight your way through Dark Souls before you get slapped into Bloodborne, and that's your Sekiro revive. Also, platforming. This sounds reductive, but I personally am a fan of how it all came together. For as dark and ruined as the world of Axiom is, Axiom being the normal, the Umbral Realm seems to be both dead and alive at once. The world becomes covered in this semi-organic looking material, arms and eyes sprout out all over the walls, and at the same time, the layout of the levels usually become altered. Walls disappear, ladders that weren't there before can be climbed, platforms that jut from the walls can be pushed around between nodes to float between areas. While traversing through the Umbral, an eyeball icon appears in the corner of the screen with the circle around it slowly filling. This represents your dread, which signifies how long you can spend in the realm, before some of the most elite enemies in the game show up to kill you mercilessly. The longer you spend in the Umbral, the more experience you gain from killing enemies, which are much more plentiful here, of course. The first time playing, you only come away with a vague sense of these things here in the Sepulchre, along with the feeling that you're going to need to use the lamp as a natural extension of your character in order to know when the best time to traverse is, or become bold enough to simply exist there for as long as you can. Abandoned Redcopes lies on the old road in the outskirts of Mornstead. It was burned and left to rot a long time ago, and after fighting my way out of the Sepulchre beneath it, I had already upgraded my arsenal. Rather than fighting with just the bucket weapon the game gave my condemned, I was already dual-wielding the bucket with some sticks I found nailed together. Abandoned Red Copse is where the game teaches the player basic navigation in combat, and also introduces a strange character with a skeleton arm and tattoos on his face called the Iron Wayfarer. He's another lamp bearer, and warns us that we've already stepped in some shit now that we have a lamp of our own. On a side note, I'm not sure how I feel about a bunch of lamp bearers walking around at the same time in the same world, but I don't really want to get into it. It seems at first like it's a curse and artifact exclusive to a single person walking around, but when it becomes convenient, the game forgets this rule and slips something in that doesn't quite add up if you're looking at it closely. Regardless, pressing onto the end of Red Copse nets a lot of interesting items to use if you're needing new starting equipment, and you meet a lot of the most common enemies in the game. Patrolling Rogar foot soldiers and hooded ranged spellcasters called Corrupted Pilgrims. After a short little jaunt through these creepy woods, the first bosses of the game are waiting on you. In the clearing we get to meet our first hallowed sentinel, Holy Bulwark Otto, a grim-looking knight in stained white cloth and wielding a giant spiked mace comes lunging toward us. He's not very difficult, but the moment you do, the dragon demon guy from earlier shows up yet again. This is going to become a recurring thing. This is the Light Reaper, a special Rogar created by Adir to specifically hunt lampbearers, and I guess you could call him the main antagonist of the game, following the player character around the world and trying to kill them at different points. He reminds me more of the Pursuer from Dark Souls 2 than a main villain, only he won't reappear if you're able to kill him with any of the encounters. He makes even quicker work of my guy than he did the previous Dark Crusader, and right before I catch the record for the absolute shortest tenure as Lampbearer ever, the Iron Wayfarer intervenes and I guess chases him off. Before the game lets me go out of the tutorial, I still have one boss fight left before entering Skyrest Bridge and meeting up with the mysterious guy who seems to have some answers about what's going on with our lamp. If Auto was a test of basic controls and the Light Reaper was there to humble me for basically no-hitting the knight, Pieta serves as the first real skill challenge. Standing vigil over the shattered bridge, Pieta is one of the few Hallowed Sentinels left who hasn't completely lost her mind. What we see instead is a crisis of identity and faith playing out. In her cutscene, she says in so many words that even as she's seen her brothers and sisters within the Sentinels fall into corruption, she's held firm in her own resolve, and honored a pledge of patience to the Exactor, which is a very interesting little bit of dialogue that took me like 3 playthroughs to actually understand. What she cannot stand is seeing not the Dark Crusader she was expecting, but that Aureus would grant this tool to an outsider, a new lamp bearer who's done nothing to deserve the gift. It's not that she wants the Umbral lamp for herself, it's that she wants you to not have it. Mostly her boss fight is about dodging and parrying, and even though you can bring the Iron Wayfarer as an NPC summon to help you with the fight, I found it's usually easier to take her on myself. Her sword appears to have shattered some time ago, either against a Rogar or a former ally, and now the hilt is powered by her faith alone to create a sort of lightsaber. Faith saber. I think the game turned her sword into a giant glowing baton to make it easier to see when her swings are coming down and parry or dodge, and you have to have gotten into some kind of groove with your weapons and gear by this point to be able to continue. Using the fire salts the game gives you right outside the arena takes huge chunks of her health, and pairing that with good defensive timing levels the field tremendously once you've gotten the hang of it. Although she herself doesn't have an umbral lamp, some kind of force is capable of reanimating her, even when she dies, which I'm pretty sure she wasn't aware of until this moment. You gather a special item if you use this lamp to soulflay the memory outside of her arena. A frozen moment of Pieta's desperate plea to her god as the gates of Skyrest were locked for the last time, and the road through Mornstead finally closed. After entering Skyrest, the player meets Exactor Dunmire again, the guy with the grimdark pimp outfit from earlier. His congratulations are short-lived though, since it's only now that the real work can begin. He alone has completed the journey in one piece, having set out with 2 other Crusaders. One of them was the Lampbearer Paladin Isaac, whose death we saw at the hands of the Light Reaper and who got us into this whole mess. The other is missing, for now. Our main goal, according to Dunmire, is to use the lamp to cleanse the 5 beacons, though each is protected by one of the Colossal Guardians. Behind him now stands a friendly Pieta, who apologizes for trying to kill us before and pledges to assist on our journey. Sure, we'll get over it as fast as you did. Using her radiant magic, she's able to enhance the healing effect of our Sanguinarix, this game's version of the Estus flask. The Sanguinarix itself contains doses of her supernatural blood that we consume to stay alive between vestiges, and replenishes upon resting. She's also my favorite NPC to use for boss fights, often feeling like the most fitting person to be helping us out on our quest to find the beacons. There's quite a handful of NPCs congregated around Skyrest, a nobleman named Andreas, who is descended from the ruler of Mornstead back in the first game. Stoneman, the captain of a group of soldiers called the Fidelis, who have taken refuge here in their failing hunt for corrupted sentinels. A few of them are merchants that sell useful stuff. I believe all of them have their own quest line of some sort. Finally, and most importantly to us, when you go into the Umbral Realm, another merchant waits in one of the separated spokes of the hub. Molehue, an ancient mass of hair and arms that always sounds strangely jolly. He sells umbral items, and can upgrade our lamp to fit more of the eyeballs we'll find lying around the world into the sockets that belonged to the previous lamp bearers. Rather than having to traverse the world and find the NPCs to send back to the hub, as is tradition in so many of these games, I get the feeling that it was Exactor Dunmire who put in the legwork for us sometime before he arrived. We'll find more people scattered around Mornstead, but here in the beginning, to find all these different representatives of the factions banding together to try and save the Hallowed Sentinels from whatever corruption is taking root, is very cool and narratively fitting. Talking to a lot of these NPCs, you get another feeling, that it was some kind of mixture of delusion, promises, or superstition that led people like Stomand and Andreas to believe that they're supposed to be next in line to bear the lamp. This, coupled with that thing Pieta said about the Exactor's promises, is what leads me to believe it was Dunmire who got all these helpful people together, who still feel it's their duty to try and help us save the kingdom, or stick close by and wait for us to finally be killed off, so they can get their chance. Up until now, the game has been mostly linear, with a few hidden things lying around, but once the player steps out of the other side of Skyrest Bridge and onto the planks and beams that make up Pilgrim's Perch, something happens that I've been waiting to talk about until now. The world opens up for the first time. See, up until now, there have been glimpses of the larger world out over the treetops of Redcope's forest, and from one little part of the sealed gate by the Pieta fight. The focus of the game has been mostly on the corridors and arenas that we've been picking our way through, showing off the gruesome details of the ruined world that are right up in the player's face. The first time that you walk out onto one of these vistas and get to see the entirety of not just Mornstead, but the wider Oathlands beyond is just incredible. When we play these Souls-likes, having a sense of place within the world gives it more of a purpose. From the peaks that we're standing on, strewn with immense bells and connecting hallways, we can look across the plains below to the Hand of God Mountains dominating much of the landscape. 5 immense earthworks clawing up from the rivers of lava pulling at its wrist and bleeding across the lands below. Up in the higher mountains across from us, the tips of castles and structures dot the horizon, faraway kingdoms whose aid was either exhausted or ignored. The feeling of standing here and staring out across the world gives me a similar feeling to when I'm standing in Majula, the hub world of Dark Souls 2. I promise that I've played other Souls-likes, it's just that these two are weirdly linked together in my mind. From the cliffside coast of Majula, you can look out across the waves and see the Tower of Flame in the distance, or turn around and look out over the forests and mountains to see Dranglake Castle brooding. Here in Lords, getting the view of the Hand of God Mountains isn't showing us where we'll be going in this entry, but instead where we came from. The events of the first game largely took place around the monastery that rests among the petrified bones of a deer's hand, and so the first one of the almost panoramic views gives us a sense of placement in the connected world, and shows off the level of care the designers put into crafting the entire world. Later in the game, there are vantage points that we can see down into later areas, like the Forsaken Fen or around the locked gate in Redcope's village that leads to the Fife of the Chill Curse. And at any point you can use the beacons that stretch all of the way up into the sky as guides, and your map to get a general idea of where in Mornstead you are, and that's about as useful as the area maps get, to be honest. It's also here that we both meet yet another merchant who gives us a really cool stick, and we find an incredibly powerful spear to use for the next few bosses. Have I mentioned how good the landscapes are yet? I have, but anyway, going into the Umbral Realm here in Pilgrim's Perch reveals these colossal, faceless monsters frozen in place, reaching up towards the sky or clambering over one another. The sun is either revealed to be or replaced with a gigantic eye, staring down on the world as we cut our way across the small wooden road and into the bell room to find another vestige. When we're in the Umbral, we find all sorts of new types of enemies. Little flying gremlin douchebags are some of my favorites, along with the Womb of Despair, a moth lady who barfs up umbral eggs, and all of these things begin to reflect something that's hard to put into words, but it's some kind of theme here at work among all of the chthonic monstrosities. Besides the memories we can interact with, umbral bellies can be soul-flayed open with the lamp to rip hidden treasures out of the sockets. It's tempting to think of the Umbral at first as this land of the dead, but that feeling gets replaced quickly with it being more of this land of the unseen and unsaid, a land of wasted otherness. From here, we can branch out and explore in multiple directions, either back across the perch to explore below, or climbing up into the temple we've found to progress. If the game has been teaching you slowly across these opening levels as it's progressed on a single track, now the curtains are pulled back to show how many different paths can be explored. The new enemies the game adds, lightly armored soldiers of the Sentinels, naked giants with their heads clad in immense spiked cages, show that it's not a world populated just by demons and undead things, but by the last remnants of humanity here in Mornstead who have gone equally mad. Or maybe they existed this way before, I'm not sure. The lore of the items in the game hint that this madness may have been the norm before the Rogar invasion. I love this constant feeling of the extreme opposites meeting and burning away the world, rather than walking through the ashes of a world that used to have a bunch of cool stuff going on that's so common in these games. Before fighting a flagellant called the Scourge Sister, we meet yet another character, Damaros the Marked, who warns us against cleansing the beacons, and presents us with our first alternate route to an ending. Why help to uphold the hypocrisy of the Orion Church, she asks, who by all reports are even more vicious in their oppression of mankind. If they demand even greater fealty than a deer and are willing to exterminate even their own followers if they feel it will bring them closer to purity, what's really worth preserving? Damaros isn't entirely wrong, as we end up seeing over the course of the game. In fact, these areas we're walking through now, and the endgame area where Judge Cleric, now revered as a demigod, resides, used to belong ancestrally to an older sacred order called the Descryers of Dawn, who were purged from their homes by the Hallowed Sentinels at some point. Over time, the path to Orius's light has been narrowed until it led through Judge Cleric and her Sentinels, or not at all. This absolute saturation of lore, symbolism, and hidden meanings seeded throughout the first few levels of the game introduces us into a world that's so deeply entrenched in suffering and melancholy that it chokes the entire atmosphere in this feeling. Even when the sun is shining down on Mornstead, it's never bringing that comforting feeling you get back in like Majula, or outside. It is either a pale, cold sunlight or a distant evening star that only makes the shadows grow longer. As is so often the case, once we know the umbral truth, the sun has this artificial wrongness to it that can never be unseen. Like so many Souls-likes, these narrative details are going by half-said, and at the same speed you're sprinting and killing things. This narrative about the divine conflict isn't close to being the only story being told here, but rather has the feeling of mythology that's still being decided upon in the background, while the mortal realm tries to survive underneath. The more immediate action and set pieces of the game are so enthralling that it takes having watched lore videos or having studied the game yourself over multiple plays, and a lot of item reading and close listening to get a fuller understanding of what's going on in the game. I've played over 200 hours at this point since its release, and still learning things over the course of replaying and reading the game 2 more times just to get the footage I needed to make this. And I'm not talking like minor plot details, I'm talking huge reveals that both answered questions I'd had from the beginning, and deepened both my understanding and appreciation for the story altogether. By the time I'm reaching the first beacon, I've fallen into a really fun combination of using dual-wielded swords and poison spells, which will become my favorite way of going through this entire playthrough. Not to brag, but the real challenge won't begin until I've realized I'm about to mess up an NPC questline before it's even truly begun and heading into the late game. Inside of the obligatory poison swamp area that is outside of the beacon, there's a few interesting developments. We meet our Iron Wayfarer buddy again, who tells us he's come here to set things right, and warns us that the lamp is evil and blah blah blah. It's pretty obvious that this is Harkin, the person we played as in the first game. Why Harkin becomes a lamp bearer or when this happened, I think, goes largely unanswered, but I guess I can see why they felt the need to have a little more obvious continuity between the two games, even if it's just completely shoehorned. At the end of the Forsaken Finn... No, you know what? No, fuck that. Hold on a second. I'm stuck on this, and I'm going to go on about it. There are like 20 or so vestiges in the game. Okay, all belonging to prior lamp bearers who've been shuffled off into the Umbral long before we ever show up. Besides just putting cool names on them or designing the things to look like gnarled old shrines to local saints resting in the arms of like these big ass skeletons, every one of these vestiges comes with a unique short story giving a brief description of the lives or backstories of the lamp bearer. These stories add so fucking much to my experience playing this game. I probably don't need to say it, but I love reading stuff in these games, and all of these stories are so violent and tragic that even resting at a checkpoint reminds you not only of the grimdark events that all of these characters meet, but your own fate as well. I would happily spend an entire chunk of this video simply reading off vestige stories, but this is going to take too long as is. Why? Why don't we get one of these badass characters as our Umbral guide? People like the Mute Outlander, known only as the Pale Butcher, would have been an amazing antagonist, or Lydia the Witch could have told us her tragic story firsthand. It's just weird and a little disappointing that we have all of these really cool characters' backstories, but they're all dead and gone in favor of Harkin, who I still don't really find all that compelling, even 1,000 years later. Anyway, at the end of the Forsaken Finn, for our first fight with one of the Colossal Guardians, we meet the beheaded knight, Latimer, also called the Hushed Saint. Replicating the self-sacrifice of the god Aureus, Latimer willingly beheaded himself in order to consecrate the first beacon, and became a saint in the process. His fight is a bitch and a half the first few times you play the game, but gets much simpler on subsequent playthroughs. Once he's defeated, you get your first decision point that will affect the ending of the game, whether or not to cleanse the beacon. I'm going for the secret third ending of the game, which requires you to not cleanse any, so I simply turn and head on to the next one, with the Deer's Malignance seeping through the crimson beam and into the black sky above the swamps. It's become the official line of CI games that Lords underwent the death by 1,000 cuts after its release, prompting huge updates and fixes to the game alongside the added content roadmap that's functionally DLC for the game. There is really only one way to fix 1,000 cuts. I probably don't need to say it, but playing Lords at release and playing the game here in 2025 are remarkably different experiences. There have been a ton of videos from other creators covering a lot of the changes in more detail than I'm going to do here. And before I go into how the game's been changed, I also want to point out that I never really had the same issues that other people did. I'm not saying that the problems weren't there, I just wasn't as critical back then as I am now, and didn't notice the flaws the game had before. I had the occasional performance drop, and one time during a multiplayer invasion, my dude fell through the level geometry and just floated around as a god cam for a while before the game crashed, which was kinda cool. Combat, movement, navigation, all of it did have a janky, slower feel to it, but that was just Lords. The same way that I've mentioned Dark Souls 2 a few times at this point, I used to have this very sincere working assumption that Lords of the Fallen was basically a PS5 remake of Dark Souls 2 because of this mechanical jank mixed with the visual grandeur. As charming as the most perverse parts of me found this, it's also not great game design when you have tons of platforming across the environments. I remember getting stuck on the very first jump of the game more than once, and kind of hating platforming sections, where now they feel much more natural to travel across, and more fluid. Since then, the game has evolved so much that it feels much closer to the faster, tighter combat and movement of a next-gen console game. I guess at the end of the day, I'm just glad that they've made these changes and bringing the basic interaction closer to feeling like a blend of later Soulsborne games. But part of me does miss that slogginess the old versions of Lords had. Maybe because now I have myself to blame more often when I'm killed in action, be it falling off of cliffs or messing up in combat. In this era of Souls-likes, combat is expected to be faster and meaner than what we're used to, and Lords finally delivers on that. The art of killing stuff in Lords of the Fallen has changed somewhat over the course of its life, which is something we'll talk more about later, but I can see how it's been tuned more to fit the original vision of the game now that it's been updated and polished. There are so many different aspects at work that it really does become its own thing, but the most obvious influences are like the developers jamming all of the Soulsborne games together at once, like I mentioned earlier. Blending things like breaking your enemy's posture bar in order to perform a grievous strike for massive damage, and beating health back out of your enemy in order to rally your own health bar, are a hodgepodge of different influences that used to have their own entire games designed entirely around them, and had enemies that were balanced accordingly. Lords reminds me, in combat more than anywhere else, that the main principle of design seems to always be go harder, blend it up, and fling it all over the place. The feedback from using weapons is punchier and more visceral than in really most other Souls-likes, which I know I say this over and over again, but this reinforces the theme heavily. When you hit an enemy, it shrieks in pain, the same way you do when you take massive damage or get knocked over. The sound design of the weapons smacking into metal or tearing flesh is amplified by little action noises that underline the massive kerchunks you hear over and over again. Blood goes flying all over the walls and puddles on the floor beneath the figures. When you perform a grievous strike, the camera pushes in tight while you attempt to eviscerate whatever you're hitting. I think a lot of these things were added to or expanded over time. I remember combat feeling a little slower and more deliberate before, with the weapons doing the usual thing of just kind of like hitting through things and taking some health away. Now, everything feels so much more reactive than it did before, and I love how the game keeps smacking things with big weapons or whirling around like a goddamn spinning top, holding two flails, enough not just to get you through a playthrough, but addictive enough to make me want to keep going back. Weapons are a little bit hard to cover because they are as varied as you could want. There's like a billion different ones to choose from, and it's so many that it's kind of hopeless to get to experiment with as full a range as I ever want to over a single play. While not always true, I'd often found it the case that defaulting into using some big-ass two-handed weapon designed around staggering enemies would be what I ended up using no matter what my intentions were. And this is still a valid failsafe if your dual-wielding flails aren't working or whatever you're trying out. This is also reflected in the way that combat informs the world itself. Whatever advantage you can get over the thing you need to kill is fair game. Having an NPC run distractions, or not, and upgrading your build is really only most of the strategy, but the game also dumps temporary damage enchantment items on you, and all but begs you to try them out on everything. This is what also makes the combat in a lot of this footage just look cool as hell. A few of these damage types are expected, like fire, poison, frost, and bleed, but then ones like smite or wither add really interesting ways of exploiting weaknesses or building your character around a theme. Stacking up a bunch of these weapon buffs before you go charging into combat feels engaging and brutal in a way that I enjoy using here, when I typically try and kill things with as little help from consumables as possible in other games. Personally, I'm more of a dual-wielding or two-handing guy than a sword and shield, since it just feels more correct in the absolute bloodbath that are boss fights and mob encounters. One thing that's lacking from the combat that would have made Lords about 100 times as complex is unique movesets for weapons. All swords swing the same way, in other words. But where this gets counteracted again is by the sheer amount of different weapons to experiment with and upgrade with talismans or duralium nuggets, but even more so by the aesthetics of the weapons themselves. Like all those broken, sharp details in the world itself, weapons and armors alike are chipped, wrapped in thorns or chains, covered in rust and blood from gods nowhere. The highest value that a weapon can have isn't in being shiny and new, but being tempered by violence over and over, long outliving their original owners. Another super welcome group of changes is to how the lamp itself works. In 2023, for some reason, you used to have to use the umbral lamp to vacuum up blobs of purple vigor that would explode out of enemies when they died. I don't know why they used this other than to get the player to use the lamp more often and pad out the game time by these little tiny increments, but it pretty much always sucked, pun not intended, and slowed the game down tremendously. The umbral lamp wielded by your player character is the major novel feature of the game that sets Lords apart, from being a blatant attempt at making Dark Souls 4 at least, and seems to be the focal point of the franchise going forward. I don't say that with disdain, by the way. I think that Lords of the Fallen is a fine inheritor of a lot of the tone of Dark Souls, but it executes it in a very unique way while keeping the medieval gothic horror aesthetic. But if they're going to force the player to use the lamp, it needs to feel right, and having to manually collect experience points off the ground is just not something that's that fun, it turns out. In taking this feature away, they tighten the play loop one very important increment that ends up making the game feel faster. When you're pairing this with the speed and movement both being ratcheted up a few notches, exploration has become twice as fast as it used to be, leaving more room for the more brutal combats. Now that you just collect the vigor naturally from the stuff you kill, this frees up buttons for the lamp to be used in the way it was always best, for exploration. You can use it to show a path of moths guiding you to the intended route, which is an incredibly useful feature for just about everybody, including me, regardless of how experienced you are. These levels become much more of an interlocking labyrinth as you progress, with keys and quest items scattered between the ends of the map that requires quite a bit of backtracking, or looking things up, or both. So being able to have all these moths guide you back towards the main path to the next beacon is really useful. One of the glaring blind spots of this essay is the multiplayer aspects, which I haven't played as much of this game on multiplayer as I have, say, like Elden Ring or something. If you're playing with the online features, you'll find these floating red lamps in the world that you can soul flay in order to avenge fallen lamp bearers by fighting a stronger version of one of the field enemies that's killed another player. Killing one grants you plucked eyeballs, one of the 3 or so online currencies that are redeemed for rewards with corresponding shrines. I didn't pay the extra money to get back online to play Lords, but you can now have shared progression co-op, along with the usual helping someone proceed while you just kind of grind levels. I don't know why this was the case, but I used to be kind of good at invading other players, probably because they never seemed to be ready to fight another person when I'd find them. It's not that I didn't want to try these features out now, but playing through Lords with someone on shared progress is something I'm kind of interested in, but the 2 new playthroughs on top of the 2 I had done recently was more than necessary. Another one of my favorite things they added to the game that I've also shamefully not interacted with enough is the extra quests. The few that I haven't gotten to, but are really stuck to me mentally, are having to interact using gestures at particular parts of the world, like statues or an old tree, and then receiving some sort of requirement. Kill 5 carrion knights with a particular flail, that sort of thing. I've gotten through most of the other added content, like stuff like the Bucket Lord quest, which I guess because I've mentioned I have to briefly explain. You meet the Bucket Lord early, and if you can perform the proper gestures, it sets you on this quest to restore the glory to the Bucket Lords, 4 men who escape the prison tower of the Hallowed Sentinels by emptying their minds and becoming one with the cleaning objects around them. It's a surprisingly compelling story told across the items you acquire, from having the Bucket Lord help you fight certain bosses, then turning in the stacks of pride that get left behind. While we're on the subject, I would say that as far as NPC questlines are concerned in general, here they're mostly hit or miss. While I'm convinced that some of them are specifically designed to annoy the player, the first one that comes to mind is the mercenary Kukujins. A lot of the quests almost require having a handwritten note taped to the side of your screen, saying something like, "Remember to pay the mercenary," or "Don't kill X until you've done Y," that sort of thing, since they have such tricky parameters that will just lock you out more often than let you skip a step to proceed. Even if it's true that Lords doesn't have the most interesting or intuitive NPC quests, there are a few cool interactions between background characters, allies, and boss enemies that make a lot of the time spent trying to figure them out worthwhile. Some are even among my favorites in all of Souls-likes, in part because they're so buried that it really feels like you're uncovering something that's been deeply hidden away. It wasn't until my 4th time beating the game that I got to the end of one of my favorite NPC's quests, and it wasn't until I was already well underway writing this that I found answers to questions that I had been pondering since the first time I finished it. I think that most of my personal favorites have less to do with the friendly NPCs we interact with, maybe excepting Pieta, and instead centers on background characters, namely Mornstead's royal family, King Bramus and Queen Sophesia. Along with the typical dark fantasy and body horror stuff that's pretty much expected, I've found a really compelling through line of psychological horror surrounding the story of King Brahmas and his connection to the Umbral. Well, his connection to everything, kind of. It's unclear whether the sickness in Brahmas's mind was some natural occurrence, or whether it was brought upon by the putrid mother's influence. Don't worry, we'll get to her. Either way, his mind was poisoned slowly, never being able to escape the feelings of paranoia and self-loathing that drove him to full madness. As this madness would take hold, and as the other kingdoms and even the Hallowed Sentinels became more enemy than ally, his wife, Sophisia, disappeared with their newborn to try and save the royal line from Brahmas himself. I think it was a mixture of Adir's meddling, umbral proximity, and good old literary tragedy that all worked to fray the king's mind and begin pulling at the threads. The Mad King trope is one I still haven't grown bored with, and ending the main story by having to slay the king in his own throne room after he's devolved into something animalistic among the ruins of his castle is kind of perfect. The reason I'm so drawn to the story around the royal family, especially Brahmas, is that this is the physical manifestation of all those morbid horrors lurking in the Umbral. The mendacious visage being the stoic, uncaring face of a father who hides weakness and fear behind a stone mask. The womb of despair, despite its name, only has a hollow shell where its childbearing parts should be, instead vomiting up the umbral eggs it tends. There are constant references to parenting, family dynamics, and all the negativity that lurks in the subconscious surrounding these things. It's a really bold move on the part of the designers to take horror inspiration from the same sort of niche that, like, Eraserhead came from, and use it so effectively to immerse the player into their world. It also provides a conclusion to the more interesting part of the Inferno ending to the game, one that I stupidly never put the pieces together to until very recently. Queen Sophisia, though appearing to be missing physically from the game entirely, and only to be recalled through paintings and memories, is actually the tortured prisoner that we saved from Skyrest Prison relatively early in the game. Their missing child, which I had suspected was the case, isn't just represented by the spurned progeny. It is the heir to the throne of Mornstead, whatever that's worth anymore. Having been caught by the Dark Crusaders, the former queen was locked inside of the same crypt she would have ended up in anyway at the end of her reign. Only now she's tortured physically by Exactor Dunmire, and mentally by watching the memory of her husband defend his love for her over and over again to an empty tomb. It took me an astounding number of playthroughs before I landed on this information, which even then I only ever found through using guides. The payoff itself isn't something spectacular or game-breaking, but there is a sense of completion to this story that had been missing, because I hadn't looked hard enough. Even when these things are left unfinished, the sense of mystery was enough for it to stay as my favorite story in the game. For every one of these really cool and well thought out quest lines that have been concealed by time and secrecy, there is another that relies on very little thought and ends up going nowhere. Captain Stoneman, one of those guys way back in the beginning who believed he was next in line to inherit the Umbral Lamp, because Dunmire told him, has pretty much nothing to add to the entire game besides selling some useful items, before he finally summons enough courage to go and try to convince Judge Cleric to answer the Fidelis' call for aid, once you've begun clearing the path towards the Summit Temple where she resides. After you find the pieces of the broken banner he wants to put back together for some reason, you find him impaled on that very banner a few minutes later. It's kind of funny, but mostly just anticlimactic, and this gets replicated more than once in equally weird and kind of pointless ways, with other NPCs that I really won't even bother going into. This is something that the developers over at CI Games have promised to address in the upcoming sequel, along with the actual ultimate sin that Lords of the Fallen commits. Of the 3 endings to the game, only one of them really has any weight to it, while the other 2 are almost upsettingly shallow. Over the course of a single playthrough, there is so much build-up surrounding the beacons themselves. The choice on the part of the player to either purge the infernal influences from them, or destroy the last of their defenses, is the central piece of agency they have, but they also inform the 2 most boring endings. Ignoring that central quest in favor of the secret ending leaves the whole point of having them in the first place behind, to dig for deeper meaning elsewhere, which is kind of cool, but then there's this ripple effect that undermines a bit too much of the plot in order to give us the hidden ending. For as much as I like it, Even that ending's weight is mostly in the boss fight, and less in bringing that opening poem full circle in ways that the Radiant and Inferno endings don't. To be fair, this is a problem that a lot of titles from this genre share. Final cutscenes and bringing real closure to the game often have to be pretty generalized due to how non-linear the progression is, or how many different ways that a character can be built, or a player can approach their playthrough. There is more than one Soulsborne game, meaning FromSoft made it, that ends with the character simply sitting down in a chair, and then the credits roll. I guess, counterintuitively, that these are kind of clever ways of ending. They don't really tell you, the player, how to feel about what you've accomplished, and leave that open for you to fill in for yourself. I don't get that impression from Lords, though. I just think that they fumbled all over their own story right there at the end, which is fine for a game that's been largely enjoyable and worth talking about for way too long. My worry for the next game, and this is just random speculation, not based in anything I can cite off the top of my head, is that they just jam a bunch of bullshit bosses at the end who each present a similar difficulty spike to the hidden ending boss, and call that more meaningful than the last game. This would be frustratingly true, but for all the wrong reasons. The final, and probably most compelling update or addition to Lords, the thing that both sets it dramatically apart from other contemporary Souls-likes, and kind of the master flourish that ties together all of the other things they've added or tweaked about the game, was the optional modifiers. Beginning a new save file now also presents you with options before you begin. Things like adding more enemy density, turning all healing in the game to withered health, meaning it gives you back the potential for healing, but that you have to kill stuff to actually heal, or taking away some of the checkpoints, all add different ways of turning up the difficulty. Some, like the pre-upgraded loot modifier, are ways of widening the play experience tremendously by not requiring nearly as many upgrade items in order to experiment with weapons or catalysts. They even put an Iron Man mode in there, which I guess turns the game into a roguelite? Yeah, no, fuck that. That's something I would try on, like, stream. You can comment if you want me to do that, I'll try it, but you guys have to come watch. Lastly, the random enemies and random loot present new challenges and sometimes humorous emergent gameplay that just isn't really there in the base game. Having these modifiers turned on sort of turns things into a deranged slot machine. I can't overstate how cool it was of the developers to basically make their own fan mods to the game and add it to the core experience you get on the console version. We'll be talking a bit more about those before we wrap up, but you guys get the point for now. All of these things got included into the game instead of DLC in the long run, probably because they didn't want to ask even fans of the game to spend more money on something they had to work so hard to fix. I'm happy that they made it up in the long run by adding such neat content to the game, even if it meant having to suffer through one of the hardest playthroughs of a Souls-like I've ever completed. And that's not even with the Iron Man mode turned on. Oh, but for now we'll get back to our original story, I guess.
You have proven yourself, child. Now, ferry them home.
Okay, yeah, sure. I've played this game a ton and never gotten more than 2 sentences out of this guy, and now he won't stop talking. I'm sure it's nothing. I've touched already on the way the game becomes less linear once you've defeated the Hushed Saint and gotten past the first beacon, at least in the actual sequence that you tackle the middle game areas in. Even if there isn't a single intended route, it always feels the most correct tackling the accessible beacons first, because I'll be damned if I pay Stoneman for a key he's going to drop before he leaves for the endgame anyway. Also, that whole thing about playing with the items as they come up as if they're key items, basically, yeah, that's less of a thing going forward. I have a few different sets of armor or weapons that I can switch between and play around with, but nothing beats the dual-wielding combo that I'm constantly using to turn into either poison or an umbral tornado. The consumables I'm using the most are resistance items and the occasional weapon enchantments, but the umbral magic in this game is really powerful once you get the hang of it. Now I just gotta find my way toward the secret ending. It all starts by traveling into Lower Calrath, the slums of the largest city of Mornstead. Without a direct path upward into the noble districts, and closer to another beacon, instead you have to descend into the Sunless Skein, which is one of my least favorite locations, and from there to the Cistern, which is one of my favorites. There's a lot of symbolism in the story of the people of the city that isn't lost on me. The poorer classes of Calrath are sent to work endlessly below ground in the mines, exploited directly by the overseers and indirectly by the nobles above. Those nobles crowd around the beacon of Upper Calrath, desperate to stay at this end of the social strata and remain in the sacred light of wealth and power. The cistern is full of umbral exploration, and is another split-off hidden from the main route. What's always set the cistern aside to me as especially memorable is having one of the best umbral set pieces in the entire game. This gigantic Cthulhu monster thing made of eyes and teeth and tentacles that reaches up from below the hanging cages and drainpipe openings. It looks like the entire city was built on top of this thing, and that this construction was built to feed it as it watches from below. Underneath the deepest parts of the city, and even below this giant horror itself, the Hallowed Sentinels buried yet another secret. This one I can't quite explain away as easily as some of the other stuff. Exactor Dunmire comes to the player early in the game with a side objective. He tells you that he needs to collect items as evidence of the Hallowed Sentinels' corruption. Most of these are found easily enough on the normal route you're walking, but as we progress, the items both become a little more strange in nature and further from the beaten path. At first, more obvious things like a Book of Sins or an aspergillum used for blood rituals. Then, evidence of prior Dark Crusaders arriving in Mornstead. Strange umbral-infused items that are hinting that Adir and his Rogar invasions are not the sickness, but they are symptoms. It begins to make more sense why our umbral lamp is such a necessary element to this whole operation, though the actual methods and end goals of the Dark Crusaders have become murky at best. See, Exactor Dunmire hasn't had a firm grasp on this thing from the beginning. Once we have gathered enough of these items for his investigations, he sends us in a slightly different direction. This time, he needs us to hunt down a traitor to the cause. When Dunmire arrived in Mornstead, he wasn't alone. We already know about Paladin Isaac, the lamp-bearer before us. The third Crusader was Harrower Dervla. Reading her item lore tells a story that, like so many others before it, evokes more questions than it gives answers. Somewhere along these Crusaders being unleashed upon Mornstead, whatever it was they were doing to people became too much for Dervla. Abandoning Dunmire and Isaac, she follows the same paths we eventually tread down through the depths and finds below a very weirdly placed sentinel outpost, a hidden cathedral of sorts. Inside, chained to an immense altar made of some long-dead thing's skull, a child who the game only calls the Martyr. Now she waits down there with him, two rejected souls weighed down by their burdens, until I come along, seeking a way to get closer to the source of the umbral influence. The fight with Harrower Dervla and the Unbroken Promise is one of the best designed fights in the game. A battle between two Dark Crusaders in a pitch-black dungeon is enough to be a good story on its own, and her moveset reinforces why she held such a high rank. She dual-wields a crossbow and a greatsword, while the Martyr behind her casts umbral spells that are meant to protect her and keep the player at a distance. I don't have any evidence to back this claim up, but her crossbow is directly inspired by the ethereal crossbow from Hexen, working as basically a shotgun that's still effective at a distance. Who the Martyr is, why they're locked away down here with the altar we use to access the most hidden area of the game, or why they fused together with Dervla's body into a thing called the Unbroken Promise for the second phase of the fight, into a thing that fights both like the monsters and the NPCs we've been facing, I have no idea. I just think it's really cool. I also believe that the game sets up the Martyr as a stand-in for a thing called the Putrid Child, the chosen of the third divine entity in the game that we go and visit if we have the required materials to interact with this altar. This is kind of a red herring, but one that gets passed over and goes unexplained even by item lore, so I'm not really sure what all this means beside it being yet another tragic story that pushes the envelope a little further into the grimdark. If you use Pieta during this boss encounter, then go back to Skyrest and talk to her, she seems strangely defensive about what just happened down there in the depths. She recognizes that the two of you just teamed up to kill a child prisoner, though she believes whatever supernatural umbral shit was going on with the kid was justification enough to put a stop to it. Maybe some part of her knows that a grotesque truth is on the cusp of being revealed, one that she plays a deeper role in than just helping us along. Being an abandoned orphan herself who was adopted by the Sentinels, Maybe she sees a glimpse at another way her own fate could have played out. Things are about to get a whole lot darker. Finding these items for Dunmire's quest, we end up traveling from end to end of Mornstead, where I spend a lot of time grinding vigor for levels. Umbral casters require a little extra care to be as effective as possible, which is fine. I keep talking about using poison spells to enchant my weapons, and I'm not even really sure that's an effective way of killing stuff, but it's fun and looks really cool. The other Umbral spells that I find to be really useful are debuff spells. My other favorite Umbral weapon, the Pale Butcher's Blade, is this massive two-handed sword that requires insane strength and agility to use. I didn't get to use it this time around, but I really recommend it. Some people play these games to deal maximum damage, and that's nice, but I want my guy to look as badass as possible when I'm fighting, especially when you have so many weapons and armors in the game that just look cool as fuck. Besides grinding kills for levels or staring at scenery in the game, I'm also constantly stuck in the inventory screen looking at pictures and reading little tidbits about the items. When reading a lot of these item lore, the focus seems placed more on adding details and cool tidbits to the canon than it does linking things together. The onus of that is placed solely on the player. It can make trying to put a concrete sequence of events or important details together almost impossible. Or at least it did for me. I get this impression you're not really supposed to understand everything, not only from the sheer volume of text, but also the fact that half of these descriptions are hidden away unless you have the proper build to understand it. Maybe that's why I stayed away from these deep dives explaining the lore, and have to work mostly off of first-hand knowledge and tidbits I've picked up from reading stuff on the wiki. It's this gigantic pile of different lore pieces, the short stories of the vestiges, and the saturation of melancholy and destruction in the world that makes Lords as compelling as it is to me. The game doesn't choose one area to run on all cylinders and sacrifice the rest. It's so over the top in every area I look that I don't understand how it was so universally panned. What the fuck was I talking about a second ago? Oh yeah, Dunmire. Once you've collected enough items for the Exactor, his temperament begins to change, becoming impatient with us to find more items that have less to do directly with the Hallowed Sentinels, and much more secretive about what his findings actually are. As we've been learning more about the Umbral Realm on our own, and whatever it is that's truly causing all of this calamity, or at least taking advantage of it to advance its own ends, Dunmire has picked up a similar trail. It is required that any game with Lovecraftian influence like Lords has, must also include somewhere a story of the consequences of learning eldritch truths not meant for human minds. The scraps of Umbral knowledge that we've collected and brought to him begin with to unveil the dark truth underneath it all, and in order to learn what is fully going on, he decides to leave Skyrest and find a way to the Umbral Realm himself. Perhaps Dunmire is what Harrow Dervlo was ultimately protecting the Martyr and the Altar from. Using a bunch of my Umbral scourings I've collected from the memories and bosses I've killed to purchase a big glob of Umbral goop from Molehue, and taking it back to the altar teleports us into the deepest part of the Umbral Realm, fully detached from anywhere in the Axiom. This is Mother's Lull, the throne of the Putrid Mother. Reaching this deepest part of the Otherworld, we are given a new purpose, to reach across the space and have a final audience with our new god. In order to do that, we need to collect the essence of several of the friendly NPCs in things called seed pods. Getting this ending takes some more creative sequencing on the part of the player. For one thing, it requires killing off Gerlinda the blacksmith, of all people, normally one of the most necessary NPCs to have around. There is a workaround for this, but I'll leave that up to a commenter to explain. Damaros, Adir's envoy, who wants our help in getting the Inferno ending, can just disappear from the game if you're not careful in the order you tackle Fitzroy's Gorge way back towards the beginning in, and she's needed to fulfill another seed pod. If you open the gate to Bramus Castle without beginning this quest line, you can't corrupt the Rune of Adir, and you're locked out of the Umbral ending. Yes, I'm speaking from experience. While the other two endings are straightforward enough, this third ending is so easy to fuck up that it takes a lot of the fun out of going after it having to follow things to the exact letter in a guide. Branching out on your own is almost certain to screw something up. There is another weird quirk to this ending that I confirmed doing research for this. Since it's now seed pods and umbral parasites that we're looking for as parts to the key we need to get our ending, beacons are no longer our concern. What this ends up doing is making several of the major bosses of the game optional, which is hilarious. I can justify going to fight them anyway by saying the Putrid Mother wants me clearing as many pieces off the board as possible, and we were sent here to kick Hallowed Sentinel ass. Plus, I still need the Rune of Adir to open the gate to Bramis Castle, the item that Harkon fought to claim 1,000 years ago, before handing it off to Judge Cleric for safekeeping, thus dooming Mornstead. His words, not mine. I've already talked here and there about the world and level design, but toward the end is where things begin to pick up the most. I think that what makes areas like the Cistern, Pilgrim's Perch, or the upcoming Tower of Penance my favorites are that the game plays around with its platforming in interesting ways, namely verticality. Even when these areas share a lot of the same enemy types, they all have very distinct environments that are littered between much wider areas, which keeps things from getting monotonous. I rarely mind the amount of revisiting that you end up doing to so many of these places, and what's better is that these returns usually make sense. The shortcut and passage down into the depths that we just went over is opened after returning to the Sunless Skein, and the late-game sacred grounds of Judge Cleric are only accessed after Stoneman drops that obscenely priced key that grants access to the Pilgrim's Perch Ascent. The ways a lot of the levels are designed are very aesthetically cool, but where they fall flat is in the areas that are trying to stress more environmental stuff, namely the Fief of the Chill Curse. It just doesn't feel like a snowy wasteland, though it comes right back into its own with the ruined and drowned village part. The Forsaken Fen has the drowned Shuja village and stilted enemies that make it feel a lot more immersive, pun intended that time, than the shambling candy zombies that come waddling menacingly across the snow towards you out of the derelict homes of the Kinrungir. One of my problems with areas like these is that, other than the environment being basically just textured differently, there's no real difference in how things work the same way things change in the poison or fire-filled areas. Even if it was more of a pain in the ass, it would make sense if an area covered in a layer of ice was harder to move across, and it switched the focus to navigating the terrain more. Even if the design of the Fief isn't my favorite, it's still got some cool moments. I suppose a secondary reason why I don't vibe as hard with this whole region is that some of it just doesn't make sense to me, on top of not being that visually appealing. I guess it can't all be smoldering stonework, bloody cathedrals, and foggy swamps, though. The boss fight at the end of the Fief is nothing to write home about. The Hollow Crow is mostly just you chasing a ghost girl around the arena and beating her ass while the crow tries to freeze you to death and spawns arguably too many enemies. The story behind it is cool. The local ruler and friend of the King Bramis, York, lost his niece or something in the waters and turned to the dark primal magics of the people there to bring her back from the dead. When that didn't work quite as expected, he turned to either Umbral or Adir-influenced means. I'm not exactly sure which one it is, but I'm leaning towards the Umbral based on how everything looks. Why the Hallowed Sentinels would use the gravesite of such a heretical event is one of those things that just doesn't seem right, but maybe it was Judge Cleric who York actually made his bargain with and had to trade the girl over to the crow for safekeeping or something like that. It's also here in this frozen part of the game where I broke the sequencing a little, but in a good way. The Light Reaper shows up a few times through the game, and one of those times is after defeating the Hollow Crow and passing by the beacon, in my case. You get an opportunity to kill him, but if you die here, then he won't spawn again. This pattern continues until you reach your final meeting point back in Upper Calrath, at the base of the unguarded beacon there. This is how it's gone for me, I think, every other time I've played the game, but for some reason I was able to lock into badass mode and completely destroy him early in a pretty tricky and desperate fight. Pro-Lords? Pro-Lords. Killing the Light Reaper also gets me one of the items I need for the secret ending early, his Umbral Parasite. We'll need 4 of these to unchain the lamp around Molhu's altar. If the seed pods are the lesser sacrifices, the Umbral Parasites are the major components, 3 of which stand behind relatively difficult boss fights. You'll get the Light Reapers on any given playthrough, which is the hint, but the other 3 are much harder to find. Luckily, wherever my knowledge fails, the internet is there to help. But before we get the rest of those, we have a demigod to kill. I think my absolute favorite part of the game in terms of level design and environmental storytelling are the string of levels that I'll just call the Path of Devotion. It begins with a level of the same name and leads us to our final meeting with Judge Cleric at the Empyrean. The roads outside are littered with the corpses of failed pilgrims and sentinels, and patrolled by the Rogar that await outside of the sacred grounds. After the path, we find the complex of buildings that makes up the bastion of the Hallowed Sentinels, the Manse of Hallowed Brothers belonging to the military and low-ranking group. The layout of the manse is genuinely disturbing, going from an emptied leprosy hospital to torture chambers and execution grounds, with only a few connecting hallways, most likely the same roles held by the Sentinels in Mornstead life. The boss fight here is one of the more painful ones, having to fight two things called Abiding Defenders, who are able to resurrect one another if you take too long killing them both. One quick lore note: these ladies who stand around as inanimate statues until we show up are indeed corpses of revered sentinels, put into magic armor to reanimate their bodies when they're needed. Fun stuff. For defeating them, you're rewarded with what's reportedly one of the better flails in the game. This whole level is really cool, but is really there to open the path to the good stuff: the Tower of Penance and the Abbey of the Hallowed Sisters. The Tower of Penance is this enormous spire standing off to the side of the complex, and as the name suggests, is where the prisoners and condemned are sent. My only real complaint about this level are that there is almost no enemy variety, being mostly carrion knights who are a bit of a pain in the ass. In the same vein, I also really wish that this level was bigger and more detailed. Having this almost straight up and down journey requires taking the elevator near the top, working deep back down below, and reascending afterward to finally reach the end isn't just interesting layout, but thematically fitting to the whole idea of punishment and then atonement. Climbing over the corpses either left behind or freshly made by us on our way there is the Lord's heavy metal flavoring that it needs. Turn the lights down, add lots of chains and ambient screaming, and we're just about done. Coat the entire inner walls with umbral eyes, and it becomes perfect. Waiting in the sub-basement of the tower, surrounded by hundreds of empty prisoner cages, sits Tancred, the Master of Castigations, arguing with himself in two different voices. We saw him earlier in a memory back at the execution grounds of the manse, granting the wages of sin for the other sentinels to witness. We find him down here on the cusp of losing control of himself to the secret corruption he's been hiding. To put it simply, he's his own evil twin. Reinhold is his conjoined brother, whose face comprises the back of Tancred's head. The weight of so much death and violence, corruption from without and within, and Reinhold's constant needling has cost Tancred his sanity. The ensuing fight has two very cool phases, first against Tancred as a very powerful sentinel, and then Reinhold as monstrosity once he kills his own brother to finally have control over the body they shared. Like the rest of the Tower of Penance, I feel like all this really cool stuff flies by a little too quickly, and I wish they'd spent more time fleshing out a lot of these endgame antagonists more fully. The Abbey of the Hallowed Sisters is the final stop before Judge Cleric, and this is where the game just gets cruel in its level design. A lot of really careful timing and a little luck are required on top of fighting almost non-stop field versions of prior bosses. Scourge Sisters, Hound Mistresses, Abbesses, all the sinners we've been purging before are waiting here at the end to dogpile me in mobs. I really appreciate how the architecture here looks so different from the rest of the game. It feels dramatically separate from everything we've fought through below to get here. It's cleaner in a sense, but the cracks are showing and the mold is spreading. Inside the main cathedral, you can draw on the help of Harkin one last time to help you claim the rune from the rather forgettable boss guarding it. If you do, he'll claim the rune for himself and run off, but I don't think I've ever played it this way and always assumed it was a timing thing that I never got wrong enough for him to get there first. Whatever. The path is cleared now, and we can finally get to the Empyrean to meet Judge Cleric. Mostly what's waiting on us up there is the catastrophic ruin of her keep, shrouded in storm clouds and hidden away from the eyes of Mornstead below. It's a pretty short level with a few of the same enemies we've been fighting guarding the gate that we need to open, and then after I dash through the Grand Temple, falling into the arena, which transforms into a sunny field of flowers outside of the highest beacon in Mornstead. I'm a little put off by the greeting we get from Judge Cleric, to be honest with you. and I'm not sure what the several tiny bits of dialogue we get from her are supposed to really mean, if anything. After everything that's happened and how much we've done to get here, her exact words upon meeting us are, "Aberrant child, you will know peace." And then the fight starts. I don't know what I was expecting, but it was more than, "Sup, fool, prepare to die." Maybe she's still pretending she doesn't really know what's going on or something? I don't know. I already complained about how there were a lot of anticlimactic moments all through Lords, and this one reminds me a lot of Pontiff Sullivan from Dark Souls 3. There's all this lead up to meeting this badass evil priest dude who's behind much of the fuckery going on in the game, and rather than having any sort of interaction with this antagonist, they just attack you. That's not to say there isn't storytelling in these fights. Judge Cleric's moveset is one that I really like watching and trying to analyze. Her first phase begins with basically a warm-up, where she's more reactive until her health gets to about 70%. Then, she activates her demigod abilities, getting the golden halo of radiance around her head like in a medieval painting of a saint. This is when she starts raining down arrows and swinging her banner in huge arcs, or shooting laser beams of holy light towards you. Having an NPC here helps tremendously to distract her, but don't expect them to last long. Once the first health bar is gone, her facade drops entirely. The battlefield becomes charred, and when she rises, she's no longer this radiant portrait of virtue, but 1,000 years of oppression, violence, madness, and power, all combined and finally shedding its mask. Giving into the Rogar influence that's gnawed at her sanity all this time, she now blasts infernal magic as she swings her giant flaming sword at us and sends out shockwaves of energy. This fight isn't too bad normally, but I've usually got a weapon almost maxed out at this point, and it's a pretty epic battle that ends with her slumped half dead in her burned form by the beacon she used to protect. One of the last really tricky steps at this point of the game is remembering to take the rune that you've claimed back to Mother's Lull to become a withered version of itself. It is essential to do this, or you will ruin the whole Umbral ending, which I mentioned earlier. And I did. It kind of breaks up the momentum, having to do this backtracking, and having to track down Harkin after he turns on you outside of Brahmis Castle Gate. His fight takes place, I think, in the smallest boss arena in the game, a tiny slice of bridge between Calrath and the gate of Brahmis Castle, where he ambushes you in an attempt to claim the rune for himself and do something with it. I don't know. This was one of the harder fights I ran into this playthrough. He's super resistant to all the poison and wither damage I was trying to deal. After defeating him, you have to track him down way back to the snow level, where you can finally claim his Umbral Parasite and put an end to his story. At least I really hope so. If he shows up in the next game, I'm going to be thoroughly disappointed. The redeeming side of this whole sidetrack is that, if you time things correctly, you should meet Exactor Dunmire down here in Mother's Lull, having finally broken through and learned the Umbral truth, only it's cost him both his sanity and his clothes to do so. Now he mostly just screams and writhes around on his stomach. I didn't go back and claim it on this playthrough, but you can go find his clothes back in the mine somewhere. Admittedly, one of the major shortcomings of this video. And many. Anyway, finally on to Brahmis Castle. Purging the seal over the gate lets you out into the courtyard outside of the castle, which is overrun with Rogar demons and field bosses, the same way that Judge Cleric's domain was chock full of sentinels. Calrath was more of a smoldering husk compared to the castle, which has these huge gashes in the ground that overflow with lava. The enemies here are dense and difficult, and you have to kill certain Rogar versions of the abysses from earlier in order to clear certain paths. I really appreciate the way this last level is laid out, both visually and having to run back and forth across the inside of the castle once we're inside, to collect any loot we need and make our way to the throne room. It's here in the castle that we also see the memory of Queen Sophisia's last moments as royalty, attempting a secret escape with her baby from the devastation both of her kingdom and king. I think here more than anywhere the feeling that this world isn't going through cycles of death and rebirth, but stagnated in perpetual suffering is driven home. Nothing can hold back all of these primordial influences that are always using one part of the axiom to tear down another. Here is the center of that hysteria and torment. Inside of the throne room, we find King Brahmis. 100 swords pierce his gargantuan body, and he hunches, malformed and scarred, in front of a statue of his queen, the anchor to his sanity. The literary reference isn't lost on me. If King Brahmas is our great white whale, that makes us Captain Ahab. Like so many other boss fights, the game lets the moves and setting and items you get as rewards do the talking, since Brahmas is probably beyond words now at this point anyway. Using the head of Sophisia as a cudgel in one claw, and flinging handfuls of swords and javelins that pierce his body with the other, the king faces off against the Dark Crusader under the enormous likeness of a deer that lords over the empty thrones of Mornstead. All these different symbolisms and tones really help push the somewhat repetitive nature of these endgame boss fights into being memorable, even if they're not all that difficult to defeat. Once Brahmas is finally dead, you can approach the effigy of a deer and find the body of an otherwise unimportant NPC named Melchior is suspended within the statue's stomach. Plucking out this seed pod blocks a deer from reaching through the effigy, which I believe was being powered by the different things that were being fed to his stomach hole to either be consumed or consecrated. With this, we can finally get the last umbral parasites we need. The next one comes from a surprising place, and presents the biggest twist in this story that I never knew about until recently, that tied so many things together for me. When we get back to Skyrest Bridge, which now looms largely silent, there is one last person we need to soul flay in order to open the last of the columns. Before the orphan girl was renamed to Pieta and became known as She of Blessed Renewal, she was simply Eliane. As it says in her armor set description, if the Hallowed Sentinels who adopted her ever knew about the true nature of her healing blood, she would have suffered a similar or worse fate to the martyr that she herself would help us kill all these years later. Believing she was the product of Immaculate Conception, they revered her gifts of healing and rebirth. What Eliane truly is the result of inhuman experimentation done on multiple women, until one could birth the child Molehue, our friendly umbral merchant, needed to create. Once the mother was disposed of, he was able to keep an eye on Eliane, watching as she unknowingly infiltrated the Hallowed Sentinels, sharing her umbral blood as it was required with countless patients and comrades. He chose the perfect time to send this vessel of the Putrid Mother out into Mornstead to spread this umbral influence, as it coincided perfectly with the Rogar blight that was being perpetuated behind the scenes by the nobles of Calrath. Unable to rely entirely on Eliane, he needed the help of the strongest champions, and so he placed the umbral lamps into the world, and the myth of the undying lamp-bearers grew. Unable to allow such a powerful artifact to go unclaimed, eventually one falls into the hands of the Dark Crusaders, who believe they can bend its power to achieve their own ends. In one last play for power, Aureus and his Dark Crusaders, Adir and his Rogar, Judge Cleric and her Hallowed Sentinels, and the King of Mornstead are all usurped by our Lamp-Bearer in favor of the Putrid Mother. The only thing that's left are those last two umbral parasites. Like so many other figures in the game who have adopted one form to hide another, Pieta hides her umbral form even from herself until we come along and reveal it. Doing so transports us to the depths, to the place where she was conceived by the last living member of the species devoted to the Putrid Mother. Her boss fight presents a crazy difficulty spike, probably because I've never fought her before this encounter, but also because they made her incredibly badass. It took me a dozen tries before I was finally able to kill her and get to the ending. Once her parasite is claimed, and 3 of the 4 columns are opened, Molehue gives the parasite he's been incubating within himself to unchain the last pillar. Taken back to Mother's Lull, we ride the platforms across the endless abyss that surrounds her, and are given a final bit of poetry as we're absorbed into her being, and Lords of the Fallen closes as the Umbral Apocalypse begins. This has been confirmed by the developers as the canonical ending of the game. It can be an absolute pain in the ass to follow the guide, and you may even get it wrong a time or two, but when it's all said and done, I think it's worth going for this ending. Especially since the other two are so lackluster, it really does signpost that the other endings that you're missing something from the story. There was still something bothering me about it though. Even though I had played Lords recently, and then again to record this video, I didn't feel right calling my time with the game finished yet. Honestly, this whole Umbral playthrough was so easy, it was more of a challenge and bother looking up what I had to do for NPC quests and not fucking up the sequencing than it was to actually kill anything. I had gotten what I needed to collect from a lore and gameplay perspective, but I still had this feeling that I hadn't scraped the game for all it was worth. I wanted more of a challenge, and I also wanted to explore the game's modifiers that we talked about a while ago. At first I had a hard time deciding which ones to turn on, so in the end I decided to just turn all of them on, with like 2 exceptions. I didn't put Iron Man mode on because I needed to finish the game, and I didn't use Tremendous Vestige Decay, although in hindsight I probably could have. I wanted a few checkpoints, but other than that I was ready to see how chaotic the game could get. Chaotic ended up being a mild way of putting it. I'm not exactly sure what I would call what was waiting on me. If the last playthrough was all about getting my story straight, this one would be about seeing whether I knew enough about the gameplay to basically start from scratch. Just to list them out for emphasis, the modifiers I had on were increased enemy density, randomized enemies, randomized loot, pre-upgraded loot, major vestige decay, and most importantly of all, withered health. Combined, this would be as close to playing the Daughters of Ash mod for Dark Souls 1 as I'd ever been. Not being able to rely on knowing where any items besides key ones were and having to deal with random enemies all along the way are both really fun ways of playing, because it's like playing a slot machine while you're trying to fight your way through the game. Sometimes you find amazing stuff on minor enemies, most of the time you find useless bullshit at the major loot drops. Good stuff, I love like 15 hours of repeated cognitive dissonance. The pre-upgraded loot was one of those small little bones that I get to throw myself and still get to turn on as many modifiers as I can take, and really just ended up mostly saving me a lot of time and extra grinding for upgrade items in a version of the game where I can't reliably find upgrade items. This one is also amazing to have turned on if you want to play with every weapon in the game that you'll have the stats for at the same time that you need to use them. Vestige Decay could be cranked all the way up with relatively no challenge added except for this little side quest of grinding extra vigor, and constantly warping back to Molhu at Skyrest Bridge for more vestige seeds to plant in flower beds, and make temporary checkpoints. I guess with no checkpoints the game turns into Dark Souls 1 style travel, where you have to run back from the start to do any of the necessary backtracking, and this adds some strategizing with your items that was another fun element. None of these modifiers are what made this playthrough one of the most painful of any Souls-like experience I've ever had. That one belongs solely to withered health. I'd even say that with all the other modifiers turned on, it probably would have been a more fun experience, but maybe not as memorable. Withered health gives me fucking nightmares. Withered health fucking sucks. You see, there's this little quirk in Lords where you get these delays between getting withered health and getting to recover it into actual HP by dealing damage. You will never feel that small delay more urgently than when playing with withered health. Mastering that window of time is a thing you have to do already when you come back from getting dropped the first time, usually done by just rolling away and using the Sanguinarix to heal normally. But there is no normal healing, not with spells or items. Here, you have to be able to deal a lot of damage quickly, while also not taking damage. This is ball-breaking on its own, but manageable. Then, you're fighting someone like Judge Cleric, who spams area of effect attacks while she's lunging at you with a big-ass weapon, and for a minute I wasn't sure I would get to finish the playthrough. There's no getting good at this level. There is respecking into getting lucky or trying again. Maybe those people who are playing for damage and not aesthetic are onto something, I don't know. Honestly, if I knew this was the case, I probably would have gone with an Inferno build for the extra damage, which would have been useful, instead of a Radiant build for the extra healing, which was useless. But I'm also convinced that the random loot mod is coded to give you the opposite of whatever you're building toward. I'm only partially joking there, and it does tend to give you really, really cool stuff early, so we're even. Finding great in-game weapons feels even more balanced when you're fighting basically field bosses in the tutorial levels because of the random and increased enemies, which I was. Truly, an unfair amount of Carrion Knights, and it's insanely cruel, but still fun though. I think you guys get the idea. All of these different aspects of throwing off the balance of the game widens the play experience and, obviously, random factor, which for people like me screams replayability. But there's this strange thing that happens when you turn on all of the chaos at once, that it begins to balance itself back out, just in ways that you have to change your playstyle to contend with. The withered health sucked a lot of the usual power gamey fun that I have out of the room, but that was what I asked for. And even if it felt like chewing glass at more than one point, I'm still proud that I was able to get an ending out of it, and feel that much closer to understanding Lords in its entirety. Taking it back to a more desperate fight and constant fear after steamrolling these bosses for so long was weirdly gratifying, especially when it was over. Like I said before, the thing that characterizes this new era of Souls-likes to me the most is that something is tweaked or added in a way that's trying to distinguish itself from previous games, rather than trying to be lumped together with them. Lies of P took its weapons crafting and tinkering to new levels, as well as softened the penalties for dying by adding ridiculous amounts of checkpoints. Black Myth Wukong uses most of the Souls-like formula, but takes away all of the restrictions on experimenting with your build, and the penalty for dying altogether in favor of constantly advancing. Lords of the Fallen, to me, represents maybe the last Souls-like franchise that wears its influences so boldly on its sleeve, if you can see it under all that blood and viscera. It's the culmination of artwork, narrative, and gameplay that I keep returning to because they remind me so much of my favorite parts of the games that came before it, and then presents it in an original way that brings the grimdark attitudes of Warhammer 40k and Merkborg into an interactive experience that I hope continues to grow fonder in people's memories as the franchise continues. Lords to me proves that a bad game can be made into a better one. It brings the melancholy, strangeness, and action that immerses us so heavily in these worlds, and shouts a guttural war cry, announcing itself resurrected. Much like the lampbearer we play as, it has more to do before it's all said and done, for she must feed.